From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 2 minutes past 8. Welcome to Monday's edition of Cross Question. Let me tell you who's on the panel. To my left, Peter Tatchell, human rights campaigner. To his left, Andrew Mitchell, the Conservative MP for Sutton, Coldfield, former Cabinet Minister who's already making demands. He wants a question on assisted dying, so would someone please oblige? To my right, Annabel Denham, Deputy Comment Editor of the Daily Telegraph, and next to her, Sobel, making his debut on the programme. He's Labour MP for Leeds Central and Headingley. The number to call, as you well know by now, 0345 6060 973. You can WhatsApp us on that number. You can text 84850, and you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Billy is in Ventnor on the Isle of Wight. Billy, hi. What would you like to ask?
Hi, good evening, Iain, and good evening, panel, as well. It's linked predominantly to the debate you was having in the last hour, actually, to do with the calls for many millions for a general election. And I want to ask the panel, Iain, if they think that there's a level of hypocrisy behind these calls, given that so many of the people calling for this general election so soon after we've just already had one were so furious about the fact that many millions of people, 4 million indeed, were calling for a second referendum.
You mean on the Brexit referendum, yeah. Andrew Mitchell, would you like another general election?
Well, I can understand the irritation and annoyance with the government that has prompted this call for another general election, because they've gone back on what they promised in the general election, which was that taxes would not go up. I went around my constituency saying dogs bark, cats meow, and Labour puts up taxes. And so it has appeared. So I understand the irritation and annoyance that's led to people signing this petition. But is there going to be another general election? No, there isn't. We've had one with a very long lead up. The public have decided, and now the Labour Party's got to get on with governing, I hope, rather better in the next months than they have in the last months. But is there going to be a general election? No, there isn't.
Why do you think that after only 4 months, Keir Starmer is now less popular than Nigel Farage?
Because, for a number of reasons. I think, first of all, there's a huge contrast between this government and the government in 1997, which was, I lost my seat in 1997, so I still bear the marks of that, but at least under Tony Blair there was a charismatic leader who had a clear strategy. This government doesn't appear to have a strategy, and they've pissed off an enormous number of people, from the farmers to the business community, as we heard today from the head of the CBI, saying this was going to have the very reverse effect from what Labour had been hoping in terms of growth and employment. So I understand the reasons why people are signing this petition in large numbers. But as I say, I think it's a spasm of irritation and annoyance, fury even with the government. It's not actually going to lead to a general election.
No, you do realise you can't use a word like that.
Like what? General election.
No, don't repeat it. You know exactly what I'm referring to. If anybody was offended by that, I do apologise. Sobel, it does seem incredible on the face of it that the government's become so unpopular within only 4 months. Are you surprised by this petition?
Not incredible. I mean, the caller made the really good point that we had a petition to have another referendum on Brexit, and I think the figure actually for that petition was 6 million signed it.
6.2?
6.2 million, exactly, and this petition is nowhere near that number. What I'd say is we've inherited the worst economic position of any change of government since the Second World War, and the Chancellor laid out we found a £22 billion black hole when she entered the Treasury. And in the election, I just want to say, we didn't say that no tax would be put up. I mean, tonight we're going to vote on the VAT on private schools. That was in the manifesto. That's taxes going up. But nobody in their pay slip will find that they are paying additional taxes. There's employers' national insurance going up. Obviously there's inheritance tax change, which is for farmers, which is one of the main issues, and landowners. I think it's broadly worth saying landowners, and that's broadly why this petition's come forward. But I think that, we had a number of different issues, and people should give the government a chance. I don't remember people on the left asking for a petition 6 months or 4 months after Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, or Rishi Sunak. I mean, Liz Truss and other matters, she didn't get that long. She only lasted 44 days, and that was because of her own party. But, people need to be patient and see the economic results, and this will be a 4 or 5 year parliament. There won't be a general election.
It's still quite an achievement, though, isn't it, to become this unpopular so soon? I'm trying to think of another government in my lifetime that has, and I mean, Margaret Thatcher's government introduced some fairly draconian measures in their first budget in 1979, but I don't think within 3 or 4 months people were calling for a general election.
We didn't have this petition system then, so we don't know.
That is true. I'll give you that one. Annabel.
Oh, well, I mean, to the question from your caller, I'm sure that there's an element of people wanting a new vote whenever things don't go their way, and perhaps there is a streak of hypocrisy associated with that in this instance. But ultimately, this is a reflection, as Andrew says, of some of the decisions that the Labour government have made over the past 4 months, specifically the budget, but also what came before the budget with Donagate and the sleaze and the chaos that came with it, that Labour had promised that they would end when they insisted that they were a government for change. And just to some of your points, Alex, much as the Labour Party may insist that they inherited the worst set of circumstances since the Second World War, that's only true if you don't include growth or debt or inflation. Growth was going up. It's now been forecast to come down slightly in the aftermath of the budget. Debt was coming down and inflation was coming down. And whilst people may not see taxes increase on their pay slips, what they are likely to see are fewer promotion opportunities, fewer pay rise opportunities, lower bonuses. And of course, you've got to consider the unemployed who may find that they have fewer job opportunities because businesses are going to need to make cutbacks somewhere.
Peter Tatchell.
I'm not surprised that Labour's unpopular because they were never popular in the first place. Labour won only 33% of the vote at the last election. Only 20% of registered electors voted Labour. That means that, in fact, 67% of people who voted at the last election voted against Labour. So Labour claims this great landslide, but it's based on a fraudulent, corrupt electoral system, which is not what the Chartists and the suffragettes and the Labour movement traditionally fought for. And if you look at the policies since, I mean, the cuts to winter fuel payments for pensioners, the threshold is far too low. It's going to plunge an extra 50 to 100,000 pensioners into poverty in the next 2 or 3 years. You've seen the farmers' tax, inheritance tax. Again, it's way too low. The threshold is too low. It's going to penalise working families' farms. And then, of course, Labour's just hiked student tuition fees. And it's now charging students an interest rate of 7.3% on their student loans. That's absolute extortion. Unforgivable from a Labour government, which has always been about...
To be fair, that's the same as what was happening under the Conservatives.
Well, yes, but they have maintained that. They've maintained that policy, which is shocking from a Labour government, which is supposed to be all about uplifting ordinary people to get a chance to have a higher education.
But it's all very well to complain about all of those things, but if you want to improve public services, you are going to have to spend more money on them. So where would you raise the money?
Well, it's very simple. A wealth tax on the mega rich. A 2% wealth tax on people with more than £10 million in assets would raise a staggering £24 billion a year. For people with that level of wealth, 2% is nothing. And, I think if they're true patriots, if they love this country, if they're genuinely committed to Britain, they'd be willing to pay that extra bit to help get us out of this mess.
Well, Andrew, you're incredibly rich. Would you be able to pay 2% on your assets?
No, I think that this country is not going to introduce a wealth tax. And although, Peter's making a good point about revenue, it's not something which I think the Labour government will entertain, and it would cause the most extraordinary adverse effects were they to do it. So I don't think there's going to be a wealth tax.
What would be the adverse effects?
Well, it would have a terrible effect on the economy. It would have a terrible effect on investment. There would be a flight. We live in a globalised world where people can decide whether they want to live in Britain or they want to go elsewhere, and enormous numbers of people would go elsewhere.
Well, that's not the experience in Scandinavia, where they have wealth taxes, and a tiny, less than 1% of the mega rich have left. Less than 1%.
The Scandinavian taxes are configured in a different way from the UK. But what I'm saying is we live in a country that is now facing the highest level of taxes at any time, I think since the First World War, let alone the Second World War. And the drive of a government, if it wants to provide growth, if it wants to provide employment, has got to be to bring taxes down and not put them up in the way that you are suggesting.
But surely those with greatest wealth have greatest responsibility.
That's why
in a fair society, those with the broadest shoulders should pay more. And we know that there are 171 billionaires in Britain. 171. They should be paying a bit more in tax. That's just fair and decent.
Well, the fairness comes from the fact that we have a progressive income tax system, which means that people who don't earn very much money or who earn on the average amount of money are paying a much lower rate of tax than people who are earning many times that. And it is through income tax, through the different rates that with the richest people paying far more, that we get the equity which you are talking about.
Well, except that the Labour government has chosen to target, pensioners with a winter fuel allowance, farmers who some of them are not well off, and of course students. Well, that's outrageous.
Well, I agree with you. There are 19,663 pensioners in the royal town of Sutton Coldfield who will be losing their winter fuel allowance. Now, some of them, like me, can afford it, but others will find there are many people in Sutton Coldfield who are asset-rich, cash poor. They will not be turning on the heating, and there will be real suffering this winter, not just in the royal town of Sutton Coldfield, but across our country.
Let's put that point to Alex, because, that is a fair point to make, isn't it? That there will be people at the bottom end of the income scale who are suffering, and you may not have put taxes up, but by cutting a benefit, that means that inevitably they will be poorer off. Nobody promised that in the Labour manifesto.
Not exactly. The point on pension winter fuel, like my mother doesn't need her winter fuel allowance, and there's many pensioners that don't, and it is unfair that other parts of society aren't receiving benefits when very wealthy pensioners are.
But these are people who are on £12,000 a year.
So what I say about that is one of the effects that this has had is that in my constituency is that we've helped pensioners look at benefit checks, and we've brought lots of pensioners into pension credit now who weren't claiming it before, who are still getting the winter fuel payment because of that, and actually they're getting council tax benefit as well because of that, so they're better off. I would say there is a section of pensioners where more mitigation should be done, and I have raised this, those earning between, say, 12 and 20,000. And I think that is an area where we should look at. But I think the idea that every single pensioner should get a winter fuel payment, I'm absolutely opposed to that. Other areas, for instance, child benefit, there's lots of women that could really do a child benefit because of the way their relationships are configured that won't be getting that because it's means tested.
Phil wants to take you to task. He says, once and for all, can you clarify with this MP, meaning you, Alex, does the £22 billion black hole yawn include the £9 billion public pay settlement? And if so, is it intellectually honest to include this in the black hole?
Well, it doesn't include the pay settlement we've just undertaken. But what I'd say about that is...
Because the NBR was saying it's a £9 billion black hole, not a £22 billion black hole.
Well, we can probably argue about it. I've not looked into them in depth myself, but I have seen the breakdown of the 22 billion as published by the Treasury. But just going back to that point about the public sector pay settlements, people did not enjoy having the level of strikes that we had, and strikes have now finished. So,
I'm not surprised because the government gave in to all of the pay demands.
Well, not exactly. There were negotiations.
Without getting anything in return.
Well, we're not undertaking strike action, and we have settled public services now, and I expect that to be the case for the rest of the Parliament. It wasn't good. My children are off school because of school strikes, and I think everybody will appreciate the fact that their trains are running because the train drivers aren't on strike. Schools are open. The hospitals are open because the junior doctors aren't on strike.
Can I just ask, I don't want to hold you personally responsible, but can you just re-answer this point about the hike in student tuition fees and this extortionate rate of 7.3% on student loans. I mean, people are having their loan repayments are increasing £1,000 in some cases every 2 or 3 months. I mean, this is a system of perpetual debt for people who should be assets to our country with the skills and education they've acquired.
Absolutely agree with you. The universities are on the brink of collapse, and there were a number of factors for that. One of them was restrictions on the number of international students coming, and actually a worsening environment for international students coming to this country, and lower numbers. The interest rate definitely should be looked at. It is an extortionate interest rate. I've been campaigning on that since 2017, and it has been rising in that time. Obviously, interest rates have
So if
risen.
we put down an amendment, will you support it to do exactly what you've just described?
I would have to read the amendment first, Andrew. But in principle, I think that is way forward. But I would actually go. I'm actually planning to go and see and I spoke to the Education Secretary about this. But we're doing a broader review. We need a much fairer settlement all round, both the universities, so the universities don't go under, and for students. And I think that this is just a little bit of papering over the cracks. What I'd say actually about the students themselves, their individual payments on the fees won't go up each month. They'll just have a longer repayment period. But I do think that we need a much better solution all round. Want to see a return to the system that I went to university, where I didn't have to pay fees and people got maintenance grants.
Annabel?
I think it's difficult to do that now.
Well, there's quite a lot of ground to cover there. On university fees, I think they ought to be higher, and I can't see any justification for expecting the taxpayer to bail out unprofitable universities or universities that can't stand on their own 2 feet. Many of those taxpayers themselves will not have gone to university. They won't have enjoyed that subsidy from previous taxpayers, and they won't be enjoying a graduate premium. To some of the points that were raised about unions, I think it's all very well having rosy relations at the moment between the Labour government and trade unions, but we've seen in the past that those relations can turn sour pretty quickly when economic reality bites. And of course, as Andrew says, they're going to agree to stop their industrial action if you offer them exactly what they're demanding, which is what Labour have done, and they've done so without requiring any productivity improvements in return, which means it's a pretty raw deal for the British taxpayer, who is now paying more in public sector salaries and getting nothing for it.
Jonathan says, Iain, you must know it's nonsense. It is cheaper to agree than continue to argue. If the Tories had accepted every request or reached a settlement on day one, no one would have been on strike and the whole economy would be better off. What a lot of arrant nonsense, Jonathan. If you just agree to every single pay demand that is made of you, be very careful what you're going to get in the future. And I think that is probably what's going to happen here. But I may be wrong. Billy, thank you for your question. We'll come to more questions in just a moment. Keep your calls coming at 0345 6060 973. It's 19 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
I make
Cross Question with Iain Dale. Watch live on Global Player. This is LBC.
8 on LBC. Andrew Mitchell, Peter Tatchell, Annabel, Denham and Alex Sobel with me answering your questions. Here's a text question from Carolina in Essex. Or is it Carolina? I don't know. What is the likelihood of Benjamin Netanyahu being arrested should he decide to step foot on UK soil? And what's the probability of Peter Tatchell making the arrest? I just added that last bit in, by the way. Just to give you a bit of background on this, a government spokesman indicated on Friday that it is likely Netanyahu would be detained, but no minister has given a definitive answer yet. The Shadow Attorney General, Lord David Wolfson, has said today that he believes the Israeli Prime Minister would have diplomatic immunity and therefore it would be against international law to attempt to arrest him. Well, that's an interesting one. Peter Tatchell, we have to come to you first on this. Having arrested, well, I can think of at least one world leader that you've attempted to arrest.
President Mugabe
yes,
of Zimbabwe, twice, once in 1999 and once in 2001.
Anyone else?
I did try to get an international arrest warrant for Henry Kissinger, former US Secretary of State, over US war crimes in Cambodia, and came very close. The case only fell in Bow Street Magistrates Court on the basis that the magistrate was not convinced that I had the wherewithal to bring the key witnesses to London to testify to put him behind bars.
Well, now what about Mr. Netanyahu? Do you think he is deserving of this arrest warrant?
Well, quite clearly anybody who commits war crimes merits an international arrest warrant and prosecution. That's the whole principle of international law, and that should be applied without fear or favour. And I'm very glad that the arrest warrant also included Hamas commander. I also
who is apparently dead.
But I also want to extend it to other Hamas commanders, to Hezbollah commanders, and to Houthi commanders, all of who have also been involved in war crimes and crimes against humanity. It's really important, for the sake of upholding international human rights law, that it isn't just a paper commitment, that it's actual reality. And I think that it's very clear that the evidence shows that Netanyahu, and indeed others, have been guilty of very serious, grave war crimes. I mean, when you think about it, 70% of the 43,000 Gazans who have been killed have been women and children. That is not consistent with targeting competence. It has been an atrocious level of civilian casualties, and quite clearly Israelis have targeted civilian infrastructure, including homes, apartments, shopping centres, supermarkets, mosques and so on, willy-nilly, and they should pay. Alex Sobel.
Well, the UK is a signatory to the Rome Statute and a member of the International Criminal Court, and I think it's very difficult to say that you're a member of a body and a signatory to a statute, founding signatory to statute, and then to pick and choose. You either are or you aren't. So either we should, either we remain in the International Criminal Court and undertake its obligations, or we leave. And I'm not sure that personally, I'm a great supporter of the ICC and the work it does. And the UK's
There have been examples of countries that haven't arrested somebody, aren't there? So if we didn't do that, we wouldn't be the first.
And this point about this is the only snag, I think, in this. In Richard Helmer, the Attorney General, has said that because he's the serving Prime Minister of his country, that he would get diplomatic immunity. The others that are named the IC arrest warrant are not serving members of a government, so that would be different. So the other people named technically should be arrested. It's just a question of whether the Israeli Prime Minister or any other Prime Minister named by the ICC to be arrested has diplomatic immunity, and therefore we can't arrest them.
Point of fact, the Rome Statute states very clearly that heads of state and high government officials do not have immunity from prosecution, that the Rome Statute applies regardless, even if they are serving presidents and prime ministers. So that's a different point. That's a very misleading claim by the Attorney General.
Because you're talking about whether they can be prosecuted. What I think we are talking about is whether he could be arrested on British soil. They're two different things.
No, the Rome Statute applies to both prosecution and arrest and trial.
And I may be mixing up my ICCs with my ICJs here, but I mean, Slobodan Milosevic could have put that argument forward for diplomatic immunity, could he not?
And Charles Taylor, but both of them, both Charles Taylor of Liberia and Slobodan Milosevic, claimed that as serving heads of state, they had exemption, but it was ruled that they didn't because the Rome Statute does not give any immunity to state officials if they've committed war crimes, crimes against humanity.
Well, I'm not sure that's right. I think you're talking about what they did while they were head of state. The issue here is whether he can be arrested if he comes here as a head of government. I think they are two different things.
But on the general point, though, do you think that the ICC were right to issue an arrest warrant?
Well, let me be clear. I am a supporter of the ICC, and indeed I marched through London supporting the ICC prosecution of General Bashir, who was an Arab leader who was killing black Africans in Darfur. And I feel very strongly that the ICC is an important part of the international architecture. However, the position here, I think, is slightly different. When this ghastly Middle East catastrophe is over and the guns are silent, we've got to find a way to move towards a two-state solution. And we've got to make sure that everyone is involved in that. It's going to require sacrifice of land by Israel. But we made great progress in Oslo with the Oslo Accords on the back of the Intifada. And we have to make sure that when this dreadful crisis is over, we're able to make real progress now and draw the poison out of something which has polluted the well of international goodwill now for so many years. So my question is whether or not the prosecutor using the ICC and issuing a warrant like this is going to make it easier or more difficult down the track to try and get progress of the type I've just described. And my deep concern is that there appears to be some sort of moral equivalence in the prosecutor's mind between the representative of an international terrorist organisation and the head of government of a democratic power in the Middle East, one of the only ones that is there. So I don't think it's helpful. If he came here, I believe that if he came on an international passport, then I think he would have exemption as a head of government from arrest here. So I'm not sure that that is a live issue. But my real concern is not with the authority of the ICC, it's that the authority is being diminished by a decision which appears more political than legal.
Annabel.
I think in a situation like this, it can be very easy to lose moral clarity. Of course it is, when you look at the scale of destruction and devastation that is being wrought on Gaza at the moment, and it's quite easy to lose sight of who the real aggressor here is. We need to remember that since that awful, murderous terrorist assault on October the 7th, the Israel Defense Forces have been engaged in a just war which is designed to root out this terrorist organisation and keep the Israeli people safe.
Well, that may be, but that's not the role of the ICC. The role of the ICC is to try and judge whether a case can be brought for genocide or war crimes.
I mean, yes, but I think in this instance, I don't have the access to the same amount of detail and documents that the ICC does. What I would say is that Israel has its own judicial system. There have been IDF soldiers who have been arrested, some of whom have been imprisoned as a consequence of their actions during this war. I mean, nobody could possibly condone genocide. But as I say, I don't think we should lose sight of who the aggressor is. And I don't think that we should conflate a war campaign with war crimes. And I think we also need to remember that for Hamas, the loss of civilian life is a propaganda tool. They are using their own people as human shields in order to drive up the death toll and force the hand of other countries or international institutions, perhaps, so that they will hamstring Israel in this war.
Let's take a quick follow-up call from David in Enfield. David, what would you like to comment on?
Yes, good evening, everyone. Does the panel think the International Criminal Court is anti-Semitic for issuing arrest warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant?
Well, that was the accusation from Netanyahu last week when he was responding to the ICC decision. He said the issuing of the warrant is an anti-Semitic step that has one goal: to deter us from having our natural right to defend ourselves against enemies who try to destroy us. Alex,
I'm Jew. My parents came here from Israel. in February, I went to those kibbutzes that Hamas attacked on October the 7th. I just want to say what Netanyahu said is absolute rubbish. The International Criminal Court cannot operate on the fact that somebody's Jewish or not Jewish. It has to operate on the evidence and take action. And that's what they do. Some of the world's best prosecutors. Netanyahu has got a long history of finding excuses for his behaviour. If you remember, before all of this, there were hundreds of thousands of protesters in the streets of Israel about judicial reforms he was trying to bring in to effectively ensure he didn't go to prison for corruption. Benjamin Netanyahu is not an example of somebody who looks and says, this is the rule of law, I put it on a high pedestal. He's somebody that acts in his own self-interest.
Andrew Mitchell?
Well, nevertheless, he is the head of government of Israel, and the way in which he gets removed is through an election. And I carry no candle at all, having been in the Foreign Office for much of the last 2 years for Netanyahu. But I will say this, that Annabel is absolutely correct. You know, like in Britain, there are lawyers in the targeting units of the Israeli Defence Force, and there is a rule of law, and that is why, as Annabel quite rightly says, there have been prosecutions. But my concern with what the prosecutor has done is I think he's playing politics rather than law. And there is this,
but on this point about that Netanyahu's accusation is that this decision is anti-Semitic. Do you think it is?
I think that I think he's playing politics too in that respect. I don't think it's anti-Semitic, but I do think that Israel has a justified reason for being very brassed off that the court appears to be showing a degree of moral equivalence between an international terrorist organisation and the head of a democratically elected government.
Well, I'm glad we've resorted to being head of a democracy doesn't give you a right to ride roughshod over human rights law and to massacre people, women and children included. That's just not what international law is about. You know, a democracy is better than a dictatorship, I agree. I've got no truck with Hamas, Hezbollah, or the Houthis. But that does not give Israel, the Israeli government, a carte blanche to commit war crimes.
Unfortunately, civilians are tragically killed in any war zone. And if we went down the road of saying that the moment there is a civilian death and we're going to try and get the head of a state in the dock, then what would that say for, the ability of democracies to wage their own wars, to protect their own people? I think it's a slightly difficult territory that we'd be wading into.
OK, well, thanks for all of your answers on that. Andrew Mitchell's dream is about to become true. It's 8:33 on LBC. Daryl Jackson has the news headlines.
Current flood defences across the UK have been called unacceptable by the Environment Secretary. Hundreds of homes were left underwater as a result of Storm Bert, with the clean-up operation starting in towns across the country. A number of British nationals are missing after a tourist yacht sank in the Red Sea off the coast of Egypt. 4 Britons were reportedly on board when it capsized. Police say a 2-year-old was inside the car when an 8-year-old girl and a man in his 30s were shot in West London. A 22-year-old man has been arrested on suspicion of attempted murder. LBC weather showers in Scotland overnight, clearer for northern England and Northern Ireland, and a low of 1 degree.
LBC.
Hello.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
Let's try and raise it.
8:36. Andrew Mitchell, Peter Tatchell, Annabel, Denham and Alex Sobel with us. Alex Sobel is Labour MP for Leeds Central and Headingley, and Annabel Denham is Deputy Comment Editor of the Daily Telegraph. And you all know who Andrew Mitchell and Peter Tatchell are. I'm assuming that everyone does, but I may be wrong. Now, Melanie in Ramsbottom in Greater Manchester says, as assisted dying is not a political matter, does the panel support the decision being made by referendum? It isn't a matter which any party has in its manifesto, so shouldn't the wider public have the deciding vote? Well, that's an interesting suggestion. Annabel Denham.
No, I don't think it's the sort of thing that should be decided by referendum. And because it's a conscience vote, my hope is that no MP will feel compelled to vote down party lines, which is why it's slightly dangerous that individuals like Wes Streeting, cabinet ministers, have been seeming to take a slightly political approach to this debate.
He has to implement it. Why shouldn't he have a view?
Because his view might sway how
perish the
other
thought.
MPs view.
Well,
but
why not?
This is supposed to be a conscience vote. This isn't supposed to be something that falls down party lines. And I personally don't think that it should. I think it's such a sensitive, emotive issue that no politician should feel pressured in any way to come down on a certain side. I know that there are concerns that some of those parliamentarians will be of faith, and that'll be what's behind their decision not to vote in favour of the bill. But I do think that the reason why somebody who is a Christian, for instance, is opposed would be the same as why someone who is a non-Christian is opposed. It's a similar moral argument, similar moral position, I think, that both people would be taking. And actually, I feel it's a mistake on the pro-campaign's part to try and paint those who are opposed as these sort of slightly nutty, fringe religious individuals, because actually a lot of people in Britain are against assisted suicide, and with good reason, in my view.
When you look at online polling on this, which I know you probably can't take much store by, but I'm sure it was on the Telegraph website the other day, they had a poll and I pressed, because I'm in favour, I pressed yes, and I was quite surprised. It was something like 70-30 in favour of assisted dying, which I wouldn't necessarily have expected from the Telegraph.
No, and I think that does seem to be growing momentum for assisted dying. My suspicion, my concern is that a lot of people are in favour of it because they don't want themselves or others to have a slow and painful death that's very difficult for not just them but their families as well to witness. But there are ways that we can avoid this. The problem shouldn't be solved by introducing assisted dying. When, if you look at the examples of other countries which have introduced it, they've all gone down the slippery slope, and all very quickly, so that it's expanded from just those with terminal illnesses.
Is that right? Which
6 months.
I mean, Canada, you have a case, but
Canada,
I'm not sure
instance,
anywhere else.
The Belgium example, the Netherlands. There are many countries where they have initially said it's only for those who have terminal illness, and then within a few months, it's transpired that actually they're going to move the goalposts and start to push down some of those safeguards and expand the criteria to those with mental health illness, for instance, eating disorders and that kind of thing. But rather than going down that road, my view is that we've got to have much better investment in palliative and hospice care. It shouldn't really be the job of the NHS to look after you right at the end of your life. You should be able to go into a hospice, or even some people be able to die at home with their families around them and with medical professionals who have a lot of experience in this, rather than being in the ward of some hospital with doctors you may not know. And, but as I say, I think that a lot of people are now in favour of it because the NHS is in a very good state. We've chronically underfunded hospice and palliative care, and ultimately they're frightened that they're not going to die with dignity.
Right. Andrew Mitchell.
Well, look, I've completely changed my mind about this since I entered the House of Commons. I greatly respect those who are on the other side of the debate to me, and I know that there is no moral answer as such. I've been the co-chair of the all-party group on it, so I'm pretty hard over in favour of the bill that Kim has now brought in before us, and which we're going to discuss and vote on Friday. And the point I would make also to the person who asked the question is there are no party lines on this. It is the duty of members of Parliament. We are elected. We've just been through a very bruising election, and those of us who've been through that process and been elected to represent the 100,000 or so people who live in our constituencies, we must make the law. It's not really for the unelected lords, although they're part of it. It's not for the police, for the DPP, for judges. It's for the elected members of Parliament now to decide whether or not we should go down this route. And as Annabel said, there is a rising number of people, but it's something like 70% at the minimum, but it may be more than that, of our constituents who are in favour. And the reason I've changed my mind is because I have listened in my advice session to families shaking with grief, telling me about the pain and indignity their mother, brother, father suffered at the end of their life. And I want it for my constituents, I want it for those whom I love, and I would ultimately want it for myself. And I believe this will be the next big, compassionate social reform that we introduce in Britain.
But should you make your decision based on anecdotal evidence? Isn't there a moral aspect to this?
Well, of course there is, but we have been discussing this for years and years. The last time we voted in the House of Commons, I voted for it then. Only about 25% of my colleagues supported it. Large numbers didn't. We've been discussing this again and again and again. And what is more, if people decide on Friday that they want at least to proceed. The second reading is about the principle of the matter. It is perfectly possible for someone to say, well, look, I will vote for the principle of the matter, but when the bill comes back at third reading, if I don't think there are adequate safeguards or I don't like the look of the bill, then I will vote against it. But surely to goodness, on Friday, for the principle's second reading, we need to give this very, very important measure a chance to get through.
Is it going to get the scrutiny it needs? Because it's a 5-hour debate. Hundreds of MPs, I think, are put in to speak. So they're probably going to be restricted to 2 or 3 minutes. You can't have a proper debate if people are restricted to 2 or 3 minutes on an issue like this.
This is about, on Friday, it's about the principle of the matter. We will vote whether we believe in principle we should go down this route or not. Now, if we vote to go down this route, then I am absolutely certain the government will make sure there is time in the House of Commons for
on the floor of the House.
Probably on the floor of the House, but a decent committee stage, so that all these matters can then be teased out. And if at the end of the day, Iain, people don't think, my colleagues in the Commons don't think it's been adequately addressed, then they can vote against a third reading.
Just finally with you, Andrew, what about the argument that Annabel put forward there about, well, in other countries it's led to a slippery slope? I mean, I remember somebody months and months ago, we were talking about this and phoned in with some supposed example from Belgium, where the Belgian state had apparently sort of, I don't know about forced somebody mentally ill to go down this road. Is that something that you're concerned about?
No, because in order for that to happen, there would have to be a change in the law that is before us, and Parliament would have to agree. And the reality is that Kim's bill is very tightly drawn. It basically will help provide for a dignified end of life, one that is pain-free and dignified for those who've got cancer. Effectively, that's the main group who are affected by this. There are huge numbers of groups which, other countries may have flirted with, or indeed in the case of Belgium and Canada, they may have introduced those schemes. That will not happen in Britain without Parliament agreeing to it, and Parliament won't.
Alex Sobel.
I mean, this is the most difficult issue that I've had to grapple with in my 7 years. And coming back to that original question about a referendum, it's not, what we're not doing on Friday is saying, do you want a cystine, yes or no? And I understand what Andrew's saying about second reading.
You kind of are.
And a referendum, we're going through a legislative process with a whole bill, with all of the process that we'll have to go through. And it's not actually the Department for Health and Social Care that's leading this debate on Friday. It's the Ministry of Justice. It's a justice issue. This is about the law.
So in that case, was it right for Shabana Mahmood to give her view that this should not go through?
Well, we sort of Pandora's box sort of opened for ministers' views, wasn't it? And then they all came out. So we're sort of past that point now.
They shouldn't really have done it.
I mean, I think it's better to have waited until the debate where they would have to speak from the dispatch box. I'm not sure. I wasn't there last time this debate, so I'm not sure exactly how ministers handled it last time, whether they gave fairly neutral speeches, technical speeches, or they gave speeches giving strong opinions. So let's see what happens on Friday with that. But coming back to this referendum idea, if you think about them in Ireland with abortion, they went through a whole process of having citizens' assembly and going through a national process with this. And I think that maybe this issue needs something like that. Whether there will be time between second and third reading, we can take quite a lot of time over this. This is quite a long session. So there technically would be, I think would help, because I think we need to have a sort of broader public debate taking away these sort of arguments. So, is it a slippery slope or isn't it a slippery slope? I think we need some process to either prove Andrew right or Annabel right. I don't think we know at this stage.
Hang on a second. You very carefully haven't given us your view.
Because honestly, this is a really difficult debate and I've not come to a decision.
See, I find this incredible because you're not the first MP to come on this programme and say that. And I would have thought this was one of those issues where it's almost a sort of gut thing. So you either think this is right or not. You may want to sort of query the detail in the bill. But I find it incredible that elected politicians haven't already come to a view on this.
I think it would be a bad idea to vote on my gut on something like this.
Okay. Peter?
For those who are concerned about slippery slope, this bill, which will be before Parliament on Friday, has 15 safeguards, many more than currently exist in law. The criterion are very clear. A person would only be eligible if they are diagnosed with a terminal illness and with less than 6 months to live. That would have to be independently corroborated by 2 different doctors. They'd have to assess either the person had 6 months or less to live, and B, that they had a terminal illness, and thirdly, that they were a sound mind and a capacity to make that judgment. And if there's any doubt, there would have to be a psychiatrist's view. On top of that, then the whole process would have to be reviewed and approved by a High Court judge. So I think those safeguards are very, very clear. And I understand why people are concerned, but those safeguards are there. So I'm very certain that people are not going to be pressured or coerced. This is going to be a decision that they will take in due course with appropriate medical, psychiatric and judicial oversight.
So I completely agree with every word that Peter said. But I just to Alex, can I say this? I hope, as an esteemed colleague, you, like me, must exercise your own judgment. It's free of party politics. We've got to represent the people who sent us to Westminster. But I hope that you may feel that giving it a second reading is not a commitment. It's giving a chance for the debate to take place. And then if you don't agree with what's in the bill, you can vote against it at third reading. And on the point of a referendum, I'm rather against referenda. We are a parliamentary democracy. We are elected to make these decisions, and we should do it. And in terms of a citizens' assembly, we are the citizens' assembly. We're the Parliament of the United Kingdom, and that's why I think that we really must get off the pot and make a decision. Really.
Why did you sigh so heavily then?
Well, because I think that there needs to be some sort of public debate. So we're sent with a lot of pressures on us from constituents. And then, this Andrew actually said about the House. This actually shows the whole why the House was a bit of an anathema to me, because these unelected people are going to get a say, an equal say on this at the end of the day.
Who?
The Lords, yeah? And they're not a people's assembly, a citizens' assembly in any sense of the word. So I think that going through that process where people understand that by sort of sortition process where people are randomly selected with experts go through this over a number of months in a public process which is filmed and scrutinised, which is what they did in Ireland, would give, I think, a lot more public confidence if they, depending obviously what conclusion they came to, you can't prejudge what conclusion they came to, but in Ireland, the people that thought that the conclusion they came to was the conclusion they came to that they should support passing a law in favour of abortion. So let's see.
Right. Well, interesting debate. We're going to be devoting the whole of Thursday's programme to this subject in various different ways. So that's obviously the night before the debate. So I hope you'll be joining us for that. We'll come to more of your questions in just a moment. It's 10 to 9.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
Andrew Mitchell, Peter Tatchell, Annabel, Denham and Alex Sobel here with us. Scott in West Hampstead, what would you like to ask?
Hello, Ian. Good evening, panel. Yes, I've got what I hope is an interesting question for you all. Is Britain becoming a nation of couch potatoes, malingerers and work-shy individuals? If so, what do we do about it?
Well, Keir Starmer has promised to make sweeping changes to the welfare system to reduce what he calls a bulging benefits bill, with young people who refuse jobs set to have their payments stopped as a consequence. Peter Tatchell.
I think there are a lot of people out there who sadly are ill. They don't have the capacity to work. Certainly they need to be given the encouragement, support and training to get them back into work. But I think the war on benefit cheats, so-called, which has been going on for decades, it's made very little impact. And actually, I think that this is likely to also fail. I wish we could get more people back into work. I wish we could get more productive people into our economy, because that's what we need. But it's very, very difficult when we have a very unhealthy society. We have a big problem with the National Health Service, which is geared towards curing sickness rather than preventing it. I know the new government has promised to shift that emphasis towards prevention rather than cure, but we've got a long way to go. And, you know, it's very difficult for lots of families to buy nutritious food cheaply. So they choose the sort of unhealthy options. There's lots of things we could be doing to make Britain healthier again, and therefore get people back into work, rather than rounding on people who, for the most part, through no fault of themselves, are unable to work.
1.2 million people not in education, training or employment. You really believe that the majority of those are ill?
Well, I think some of them are, yes.
I think some of them are. But, I mean, this is a massive increase since COVID. Annabel?
I agree with you, Ian, that we need to have perhaps a degree of scepticism, given that we've seen the number of people who are economically inactive increase enormously since before the pandemic. A lot of it has been driven by a rise in mental illness, and whilst I think it's very welcome that in recent decades we've removed the stigma attached to psychological conditions, I think we're now at risk of conflating the roller coasters of life, normal human emotions, with a mental disorder. And there's a lot of self-diagnosis, and you've got time-strapped GPs who are perhaps too readily signing sick notes. In terms of what we need to do, I think we have to have tougher work capability assessments. We have to have a major cultural change back to this idea that work is good for us, because often it is. Of course, there are some people who are genuinely too sick to work, and we ought to provide them with the support that they need. But that safety net should be designed purely for those who are genuinely too unwell to work. We need to make it easier for businesses to take on workers. Labour, unfortunately, are going in the absolute opposite direction. We need to reform the NHS, not just give it more money, but actually bring in root and branch reform so that the UK doesn't have one of the worst healthcare systems in the developed world. And when it comes to that question of prevention, I'm afraid it makes me slightly nervous, because it's the idea that we ought to reform ourselves rather than reform our institutions. And you can easily buy very nutritious food very cheaply. You can buy a bag of potatoes for about £1, a bag of carrots for less than that, pasta. There are many foods that you can buy that are cheaper than purchasing a ready-made pizza or something.
Let them eat potatoes, says Annabel Denham. That's the viral clip from this programme. Alex?
I think we are having a mental health crisis, and I think COVID brought a lot of that to bear. And I think people are trying. So, you know, programs like Count 5K, I've got my part run barcode here, the amount of people I see going to do part run. People want to do that. Our mental health services are absolutely flawed. It's very hard to get any support through them, particularly for young people. People need things like access to nature and healthy, nutritious food, as Peter said. And people also need to be able to know how to cook it. And not everybody's family environment, home environment provides that. Just because ours did doesn't mean that everybody else does, and they don't know how to do that. And we had programs to help people to learn how to cook. But the other thing I want to say is, at the end of the Gordon Brown government, he brought in a scheme called Future Jobs Fund, which gave young people a 6-month funded employment and support program, and it was a hugely successful program, and the majority of those young people then carried on in work. And what we need to be doing is giving people opportunities and supporting them, and I think they will then flourish.
Andrew, do you mind not answering this question? And because I do want to get this next question in, but I'm only going to put it to you because I'm really interested in you. Well, in fact, we'll try and get you all in, but we're running out of time. Grace in Ealing. Hello, Grace.
Hi. Lots of discussion about aid and whether it works and how it's necessary to involve the recipients in the design of it. But there's actually an awful lot of wealth being extracted from the continent of Africa. So while some people are saying, well, clearly aid doesn't work because things haven't been resolved, actually there's more wealth coming out of the developing world than going to the developing world. So what can be done to stop the extraction of wealth from places in Africa, such as through ridiculous debt interest and tax offshoring and corporate greed?
And this is on the back of all the row with Ed Sheeran and Bob Geldof and all that. Andrew, as a former International Development Secretary.
Well, Grace has made a very good point. There is a lot of money is stolen from Africa because the systems the governments have there to protect themselves from that are very weak. And we have to crack down on corrupt politicians, corrupt warlords, bent business people who are stealing money from Africa. And one of the ways we do it is by these open registers of beneficial ownership where people have to explain if you're an overseas territory, a Crown dependency, or indeed London, through which, as a matter of fact, the National Crime Agency has in the past suggested that 40% of stolen money, dirty money, comes through London, the overseas territories and the Crown dependencies. So sunlight is the best disinfectant. Making sure that you have open registers so people can see who is the owner of this money, that is a very significant way of stopping this extraordinary level of theft.
Why didn't you introduce all of that when you were Deputy Foreign Secretary?
Well, we tried very hard indeed, and David Cameron, who at his G8 back in 2016 introduced these registers here, we have not yet got them introduced in all the overseas territories, nor in the Crown dependencies. Margaret Hodge and I nearly defeated Mrs May's government on this very point back in 2018, and I very much hope that all of us together in Parliament can insist on the changes we wanted made then being introduced.
Right, I'd love to bring you all in on this, but we've run out of time, so just time for our fun question from Kira in Lincoln. Colleen Rooney has been recounting to the other I'm a Celebrity contestants about when she and her family met with Donald Trump at the White House while Wayne was the coach of Washington, D.C.'s soccer team. Who's the most famous person you've ever met? Annabel.
I thought you were going to come to me first there, Ian. I'd like to know Kira's definition of met, because I was once in a restaurant with Elton John, but I'm not sure I can quite say that I went and shook his hand. Actually exchanged a word with Kate Moss in the same restaurant. I keep going back in there. Spot celebrities, and a friend of mine had a baby, and I actually asked if I could borrow her baby because Kate Moss was with her daughter, and I thought that it would give me an
icebreaker.
in. And she... not sure I'm disclosing this now that I'm talking through the story. And she did say, "Oh, look at the baby," and
a massive friendship developed.
A friendship developed.
Alex,
if only.
When I was a young activist, I shook Bill Clinton's hand twice. I'm not quite sure it meets the threshold, but since an MP, you do get to meet some famous people. The nicest person I met was Kate Blanchett. She was absolutely lovely.
Andrew Mitchell.
So I've got three to put before you. Mrs Thatcher, and Nelson Mandela, and Her Late Majesty the Queen. But I'm going to opt for Her Late Majesty the Queen.
Peter.
I wish I could say Mahendra Gandhi, Sylvia Pankhurst and Martin Luther King Jr., but alas, no.
You're going to say Robert Mugabe, aren't you?
I am going to say Robert Mugabe. Yeah. When I had him under arrest, you should have seen the look on his face. He is very dark-skinned, but a visible ashen pallor came across his face. His eyes popped, his jaw dropped. I think he thought he was going to be killed, and I thought to myself, now you know what your victims feel like. Ooh. Only we won't kill you, we're going to take you to a court of law.
What did he say?
He didn't say a word. He just recoiled in horror in the backseat of his limousine.
Well, I'm going to agree with you, Andrew. I'm going to say Her Majesty the Queen, although Cliff Richard is a close second, I think. on that bombshell, thank you all very much indeed for taking part in the programme tonight. On tomorrow's panel, we have the Conservative Shadow Work and Pension Secretary, Helen Whately, the Lib Dem MP and Chair of the Health and Social Care Select Committee, Layla Moran, the comedian, broadcaster and former diplomat, Dom Jolly, and Annabel's colleague at the Daily Telegraph, their chief political correspondent, Camilla Turner. Other newspapers are available. Coming up in the next hour, what are we going to talk about in the next hour? Oh yes, we're talking about prisoners. This is one of my favourite subjects because I think that if